Jack Harrington, a man known for his wealth and influence, sat alone in a quiet corner of a chic Manhattan restaurant, gazing through the rain-drenched window. Outside, the city shimmered with the night's steady downpour, each drop cascading down the glass like unspoken tears. To the world, Jack had everything: a successful business empire, a luxurious life, and all the comforts that money could buy. Yet none of it could mend the void that had hollowed him out for nearly 2 decades, ever since he lost Emma, the love of his life. Emma had been his anchor, the one who kept his world in focus. But after she passed away tragically 20 years ago, Jack buried himself in his work, hoping that building an empire would somehow fill the silence she left behind. He built wealth and chased power, but each milestone felt as empty as the last. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was only skimming the surface of life, missing something deeper that he could never quite place. As Jack sat, swirling his untouched glass of wine, he felt a pang of exhaustion, not just physical, but emotional. The city hummed outside, and the laughter and voices around him drifted in and out. Yet he remained isolated, lost in the weight of his own solitude. He glanced at his watch, deciding it was time to leave. There was no point in lingering here, only a reminder that even in a room full of people, he was utterly alone. Pulling on his coat, Jack stepped outside, where the night's rain greeted him with a chilly embrace. He began the walk to his apartment, his mind drifting back to Emma and the countless memories they had shared across this city. Every street corner, every old building held some fragment of their time together. He had revisited these places often, almost like a ritual, trying to keep her alive through the moments they'd once shared. As he continued walking, something caught his eye. An unusual sight for this upscale part of town. Under the awning of a closed boutique, a young woman sat huddled against the cold, clutching a small child tightly to her chest. Her clothes were thin and soaked from the rain, her shoulders hunched in a way that spoke of weariness and desperation. The sight jolted Jack from his thoughts, stirring something inside him that he couldn't quite define. He hesitated. Over the years, he had donated millions to charity, always preferring to help from a distance. Yet, here in front of him was someone in need, face to face, a reminder that wealth alone couldn't shield him from human suffering. After a brief internal battle, Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills. $300 he had withdrawn earlier, though he hadn't really needed it. Approaching her cautiously, he extended his hand. "Here," he said, handing her the money. "For you and the child. Get something warm to eat." The woman looked up, startled. Her expression shifted from confusion to gratitude as she accepted the money, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Her gaze lingered on Jack's for a moment, a flash of something unspoken passing between them. And then, with a slight nod, Jack turned and walked away. Yet as he continued down the sidewalk, the image of the woman and her child clung to him. There was something about her, something hauntingly familiar, though he couldn't place it. But by the time he reached his apartment, he was mentally exhausted, and he dismissed the strange feeling as a figment of his own restless mind. The following morning, as was his custom, Jack prepared for his weekly visit to Emma's grave. It was a ritual he had maintained ever since she passed, a way of keeping their connection alive even in death. He dressed in a crisp suit, his usual armor, and set out into the city, the chill of the previous night's rain lingering in the air. When he arrived at the cemetery, the place was silent, enveloped in a somber stillness that Jack found both comforting and unsettling. He followed the familiar path, winding through the rows of headstones until he reached Emma's grave. But today, something was different. A figure knelt beside her tombstone, shoulders hunched, body shaking as if in quiet sorrow. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he recognized her. The young woman from the previous night. She was here, with her child in her arms, her head bowed as she whispered words only the wind could carry away. Jack stood frozen, a whirl of confusion and curiosity swirling within him. What could possibly connect this stranger to his beloved Emma? Finally, he cleared his throat, his voice softer than he intended. "Excuse me." The woman startled, turning to face him with eyes still red from crying. Her face, so weary and full of pain, struck a chord deep within Jack, one that made his own heart ache with unspoken grief. I'm sorry," she stammered, wiping her face with her sleeve. "I didn't mean to intrude." Jack shook his head, his mind racing with questions. "You're not intruding. I saw you here and—" His words trailed off, unable to form a coherent question. But he knew he had to understand why this stranger was at Emma's grave. The woman seemed to hesitate, as if weighing whether to share something with him. After a long pause, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with a sadness and strength that took Jack by surprise. "My name is Sophie," she began, her voice a blend of courage and vulnerability. "Emma. She was my mother." Jack felt the ground shift beneath him, a sickening feeling rising within him as he tried to grasp her words. No, it couldn't be. Emma had never told him she had a child. She would have told him. They had been everything to each other, shared every secret, every dream. His mind raced, struggling to make sense of the impossible. "Your mother?" he repeated, his voice barely more than a whisper. "But that can't be. Emma never had a child." Sophie's expression softened, a look of quiet empathy filling her gaze. "She did," she replied, her voice almost gentle. "She had me. She never told you." Jack's world spun, every certainty he had ever known unraveling with each word she spoke. He stumbled backward, trying to hold on to some shred of stability, yet nothing seemed solid. If this was true, then everything he thought he knew about Emma, about their life together, was a shadow of a greater truth he had never seen. Sophie spoke again, her words soft but steady, as if offering a lifeline in the storm raging within him. "I didn't know her either, not really. She passed when I was just a baby, and I was raised by another family. I only learned about her recently, and I came here to try and piece together the life I never got to know." Jack's gaze shifted to the child in her arms, a small boy with wide, curious eyes that stared back at him with a depth he couldn't explain. A connection he hadn't felt in years seemed to spark, hesitant, yet undeniable, bridging the gap between past and present. The questions surged, each one more pressing than the last. But for now, as he looked at Sophie, all Jack could do was stare, speechless and stunned, as the foundation of his life shifted beneath him. Jack stood, paralyzed, as the weight of Sophie's revelation sank deeper. His mind churned with disbelief, his heart a chaos of emotions he couldn't even begin to sort through. Emma, the woman he'd loved and mourned for so many years, had kept something so monumental from him. And now, as if rising from her memory, here stood Sophie, a piece of Emma he never knew existed. Why didn't she tell me?" Jack's voice was barely a whisper, his eyes wide and searching, clinging to the hope that there might be some explanation to soften the blow. Sophie looked down, shifting the child in her arms, a boy Jack realized must be his grandson. She sighed, as if preparing herself to recount a story she'd had to piece together, one that had likely left her with more questions than answers. "I've spent my whole life not knowing who my mother was," Sophie began. "I was raised by another family, as I told you. They didn't know much about Emma, only a few details. But after I found out who she was, I wanted to know everything about her. That's how I ended up here, at her grave, trying to find a connection, anything that could explain why she left me behind." Jack's heart twisted at her words. The pain in her voice was raw, unmistakable, and painfully familiar. In her eyes, he saw a reflection of his own grief, a deep sorrow that had shaped her life just as it had shaped his. He took a step closer, his voice thick with emotion, Sophie, I don't know what to say. This is so much to process. I thought I knew everything about her. We were going to have a life together, a family, a future. But she never told me, not once, that she had a child. Sophie nodded, her gaze steady but laced with empathy. I can only guess, but from what little I've learned, I think she was afraid. Afraid of what having a child would mean. For you, for her, and for the life you were building together. Maybe she didn't want to put that burden on you. Jack's mind flashed back to memories of Emma, their late-night conversations, the way she'd sometimes stare off into the distance, a shadow of worry clouding her expression. He'd chalked it up to stress, to the pressures of their life together, never once suspecting there could be something deeper behind her silence. The baby in Sophie's arms shifted, letting out a small, sleepy sound. The tender way she cradled him stirred something in Jack, a longing he hadn't felt in years. The sight of the child brought with it a strange sense of completeness, as if Emma's presence were somehow still here, living on through this tiny, innocent life. "What's his name?" Jack asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "His name is Ethan," Sophie replied, her face softening as she looked down at the boy. "He's just over a year old." "Ethan," Jack repeated, tasting the name, letting it settle on his tongue. It was both foreign and familiar, a new chapter in his life that he hadn't chosen, yet one that felt destined, as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. Sophie watched him carefully, her gaze a blend of vulnerability and guarded hope. "I didn't come here to disrupt your life, Jack. I needed to know where I came from, to find some piece of the woman who gave me life. And if that's all this is, if we say goodbye here, I'll understand. But I couldn't let the opportunity pass without trying to understand who she was." Jack's chest tightened, a pang of regret mingling with an overwhelming desire to mend what had been broken. He looked at her, 1,000 thoughts swirling, none of them easy to articulate. "I don't want this to be goodbye, Sophie," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I never had the chance to know you, but that doesn't mean I don't want to. I lost Emma, and it felt like my entire life fell apart. Now, finding you, it's as if a piece of her is still here." A hesitant smile tugged at the corner of Sophie's lips, though her eyes remained cautious. "I'd like that too, Jack, but I think we have a long way to go." Jack nodded, understanding the truth in her words. This wasn't a fairy tale reunion. They were strangers, connected by blood, but separated by a lifetime of absence and unanswered questions. Still, he felt a stirring of hope, a sense that, perhaps, they could bridge the divide, find a way to heal together. The following weeks were a delicate dance of discovery and restraint. Jack and Sophie met for coffee, for quiet walks in the park with Ethan, for long, sometimes strained conversations about Emma and the life Jack had once shared with her. Slowly, as they spent more time together, Jack began to notice pieces of Emma in Sophie. The way she tilted her head when she was deep in thought, the way her laugh echoed Emma's soft musical tone. One afternoon, as they sat together on a park bench, watching Ethan toddle clumsily across the grass, Sophie shared a piece of her past that caught Jack off guard. "There's something I found," she said, her voice hesitant. She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn leather notebook, its pages yellowed with age. "This was among my mother's things. It's a journal she kept, right before she passed. I haven't read much of it. I wanted to wait until I could share it with you." Jack stared at the journal, his heart pounding. The sight of Emma's handwriting, even in its closed form, brought a flood of memories rushing back. Trembling, he took the journal from Sophie's hands, feeling the rough texture of the leather beneath his fingers. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Sophie nodded. "I think it's time we both heard her story." With a deep breath, Jack opened the journal, his eyes scanning the familiar script that seemed frozen in time, a relic of a life that had been stolen from him far too soon. The entries were sparse at first, snippets of Emma's day-to-day life, mentions of places they'd visited together, notes about their plans, dreams for the future. And then, about halfway through, the tone shifted. The words became heavier, laced with doubt and fear. She wrote about her feelings of inadequacy, about the pressures of their life, about a growing anxiety that had begun to consume her. And then, in one entry, he found it. "I don't know if Jack will ever forgive me for this, but I'm scared. Scared of what this will mean for us, for him. He's so focused on his work, on building a life for us, and I can't bring myself to add this weight to his shoulders. He deserves more than I can give him. Maybe one day he'll understand. I just hope he can forgive me." The words blurred before Jack's eyes as he realized the depth of Emma's struggle. She hadn't kept Sophie from him out of selfishness or deceit. She had done it out of a misguided attempt to protect him, to spare him from a burden she thought he couldn't bear. He closed the journal, his hand trembling as he looked at Sophie, unable to find the words to express the mix of anger, sorrow, and understanding that surged within him. Sophie reached over, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "I can't imagine how hard this must be for you, Jack. I spent years feeling abandoned by her, wondering why she left me behind. But reading her words, I think I finally understand. She wasn't trying to hurt us. She was just lost." Jack nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I loved her, Sophie. I loved her so much, and I thought I knew everything about her. But I see now that I only saw one side of her, the side she wanted me to see." Sophie gave a small, sad smile. "Maybe that's all any of us can do. We show the parts of ourselves that we think others need, hoping it'll be enough. But sometimes, it leaves too many things unsaid." Jack watched Ethan, who had now settled at their feet, playing with a fallen leaf. The sight of him brought a bittersweet ache to Jack's heart. He had missed so much. Sophie's childhood, her first steps, her first words. But now, with Ethan, he had a chance to be a part of something new, to make up for the lost years in whatever way he could. "Thank you for sharing this with me, Sophie," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully understand why Emma made the choices she did, but I'm grateful for the chance to know you and Ethan." Sophie's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and she gave his hand a gentle squeeze. "Thank you for wanting to be here, Jack. I know this hasn't been easy, but I think we can find a way to move forward together." Over the next few months, Jack and Sophie navigated the complexities of their newfound relationship. There were moments of tension, of misunderstandings and old wounds resurfacing. Yet, through it all, they continued to find a way forward, slowly building a bond that was as fragile as it was genuine. Jack found himself growing more attached to Ethan with each passing day. He became a regular presence in their lives, accompanying them on outings, babysitting when Sophie needed a break, and watching in awe as Ethan began to grow and explore the world. For the first time in years, Jack felt a sense of purpose, a feeling that perhaps, despite everything, there was still something worth fighting for. One evening, as they sat together in Sophie's modest apartment, Jack found himself opening up in a way he hadn't in years. He shared stories about Emma, about their dreams and the life they'd planned together. He talked about the grief that had consumed him after her death, the emptiness that had haunted him for so long. Sophie listened, her eyes filled with empathy, her hand resting on his in silent support. In that moment, Jack realized that he wasn't alone in his pain. They were both survivors of Emma's absence, both struggling to make sense of a life that had been shaped by choices neither of them had a say in. As the night wore on, Jack felt a quiet sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, he felt as though he wasn't walking it alone. Together, he and Sophie were finding a way to heal, to piece together the fragments of a life they'd both lost. And as he looked at Ethan, sleeping soundly in his crib, Jack knew that he had found something worth holding on to. A family, however unconventional, that he was determined to cherish and protect. As the weeks drifted by, Jack found himself more at ease in Sophie and Ethan's lives. Their connection was still fragile, a tentative bond woven from shared grief, curiosity, and the possibility of healing. But the wounds of the past still lingered, often casting shadows over their conversations. And sometimes, even within Jack's heart, he sensed that Sophie was still holding something back, and though he wanted to press her, he feared pushing her too far. One crisp autumn afternoon, as they walked through Central Park with Ethan toddling between them, Sophie finally broke the silence. Her voice was soft, tentative, but there was a resolve in her tone that caught Jack's attention. "There's something I need to tell you, Jack," she began, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. "Something I found recently. Something that might change the way you see things." Jack's stomach tightened. He had thought that after finding Emma's journal, there could be no more secrets, no further revelations to alter his understanding of her. But the look on Sophie's face told him otherwise. "What is it?" he asked, his voice gentle but tense. Sophie took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I didn't want to tell you at first. I was afraid it would just make things harder for you. But I think you deserve to know the truth." She stopped walking, reaching into her bag to pull out a small, weathered letter. The edges were frayed, the paper yellowed with age. She handed it to Jack, her expression serious, her eyes almost pleading for him to understand. "This was among the things my adoptive parents gave me when I turned 18, Sophie explained. "It was written by someone named Michael. He was a friend of Emma's, a close friend." Jack's heart skipped a beat. Michael. The name echoed in his memory, faint yet unmistakable. He recalled a time, years ago, when Michael had been part of their lives, a trusted friend, someone he and Emma had once shared countless dinners and conversations with. They had lost touch when Michael moved to the West Coast, but Jack had never suspected there was more to his connection with Emma. With trembling hands, Jack unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. "Emma, I know you've made your choice, and I respect that. But there's something I can't let go, something I need you to know. When I left, it wasn't because I stopped caring. It was because I couldn't bear the thought of complicating your life with Jack. You were happy, and that's all I ever wanted for you. But know this, if things had been different, if you'd ever wanted a different life, I would have given you everything I have. Forever yours, Michael." Jack's chest tightened as he read and reread the letter, each line a fresh blow to his heart. The implication was clear. Michael had loved Emma deeply, perhaps even as much as Jack had, and his departure was not simply a move for career or opportunity. It was a decision born from sacrifice, from the need to let her go. A part of him wanted to crumple the letter, to erase the possibility that Emma's heart had ever belonged to another. But a deeper part of him, the part that had spent so many years mourning her, wanted to understand. He wanted to know if she had truly loved him, if their life together had been real, or if it had only been a shadow of something she had left behind. "Did you know?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you know about Michael and your mother?" Sophie shook her head, her expression one of empathy and sadness. "I only found out when I discovered the letter. I didn't know if it meant anything, or if it was just something from her past that she had let go of. But I felt that it was important for you to know. Whatever the truth is, Jack, you deserve to be part of it." Jack turned away, the emotions swirling within him, threatening to overwhelm him. He watched Ethan playing nearby, his innocent laughter a stark contrast to the turmoil inside Jack's heart. He had spent so many years building a life with Emma, believing that he was her one and only, and now, here he was, questioning everything he thought he knew. That night, back in his apartment, Jack sat alone with Emma's journal and Michael's letter spread out before him. He pored over the entries, the words she had left behind, seeking some hint, some proof that she had loved him as deeply as he had loved her. But the truth was elusive, tangled in the fog of the past. When his phone buzzed, he nearly ignored it. But when he saw Sophie's name on the screen, he picked up, her voice a welcome anchor in the midst of his storm. "Are you all right?" she asked, her tone filled with concern. Jack sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't know, Sophie. I thought finding out the truth about Emma would bring me peace, but it's only left me with more questions." Sophie was silent for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully. "I think the truth is that we'll never really know everything about her, Jack. I had to come to terms with that myself. She made choices that affected both of us. But maybe she did love us in her own way." Her words struck a chord in Jack, a reminder that love was rarely simple or straightforward. The memories he had shared with Emma were real, even if they were incomplete. Perhaps, in her own way, Emma had loved him deeply, even if she had carried feelings for Michael that she had never expressed. "I just wish she had told me," Jack murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "If she had been honest, maybe things would have been different." "Maybe," Sophie replied softly. "But we're here now, Jack. We can't change the past, but we can choose how we move forward." Jack closed his eyes, letting her words sink in. She was right. The past was beyond his reach, but the future was something he still had a say in. And with Sophie and Ethan in his life, he had a chance to create new memories, to build something meaningful from the remnants of his shattered heart. The following day, Jack made a decision. He invited Sophie and Ethan over to his apartment, hoping to bridge the gap between their fractured histories and begin creating a new legacy together. When they arrived, he led them to a small room he hadn't opened in years, a room filled with photographs, trinkets, and memories from his life with Emma. Sophie walked around, her fingers grazing the surfaces of framed photos, the remnants of a life she had never been a part of. She paused at a picture of Emma and Jack, taken during one of their vacations, her face radiant with laughter, her eyes alight with happiness. "She was beautiful," Sophie said, her voice barely a whisper. "I wish I had known her." Jack joined her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "She would have loved you, Sophie. She would have adored Ethan. I know she kept you a secret, but that doesn't mean she didn't love you in her own way." Sophie nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "Thank you, Jack, for sharing this with me." As they stood there together, surrounded by the echoes of a past that had shaped both of them, Jack felt a sense of closure he hadn't thought possible. Emma's choices had left scars, but they didn't have to define his relationship with Sophie. Here, in this moment, he had the power to let go, to choose a path that honored both Emma's memory and the family he had found in her absence. Turning to Sophie, Jack spoke with a new resolve. "I don't know if I'll ever understand everything about Emma's choices, but I do know that I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you or Ethan." Sophie smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "You won't, Jack. I want you to be a part of our lives. I want Ethan to know his grandfather." The word hung in the air between them, a title Jack had never expected, but one that now filled him with a quiet pride. He had spent so long grieving what he'd lost, but here, in Sophie and Ethan, he had found something he never knew he needed: a family, a chance to heal, and a future worth fighting for. Over the next few months, Jack and Sophie's bond deepened. Their shared history no longer a source of pain, but a foundation upon which they could build something new. They took Ethan to the park, celebrated his milestones, and even shared quiet dinners, filling the emptiness in Jack's apartment with laughter and love. Jack still visited Emma's grave from time to time, But his visits were different now. Instead of mourning what he had lost, he reflected on what he had gained. Emma's choices had led to pain and loss, but they had also brought him Sophie and Ethan, a family that he was determined to cherish and protect. One evening, as they sat together in the warmth of his apartment, Jack looked at Sophie, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Sophie," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "For finding me, for giving me a chance to be a part of your life." Sophie smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "Thank you, Jack, for accepting me, for choosing to be my family." And as Ethan babbled happily in his high chair, Jack felt a sense of peace settle over him, a peace he hadn't known in years. The pain of the past still lingered, but it no longer weighed him down. He had found something stronger, something that transcended grief and regret, a family, a future, and a hope that would carry him forward. For the first time, Jack knew that he was not alone. He had Sophie, he had Ethan, and together, they were creating a new chapter, one filled with love, resilience, and the promise of tomorrow. Winter had arrived in New York, blanketing the city in a soft layer of snow that transformed its busy streets into a serene landscape. Jack watched from his apartment window, the quiet beauty of the scene outside, matching the calm that had settled in his heart over the past few months. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of belonging, a quiet contentment that he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. Sophie and Ethan had become a regular part of his life, filling his once empty days with warmth and purpose. The past, with all its heartbreak and secrets, had finally begun to feel like a chapter he could close. His visits to Emma's grave were no longer about mourning what he had lost, but about honoring the life they had shared. And now, with Sophie and Ethan, he was creating something beautiful out of the fragments of his broken heart. That morning, as he prepared to meet Sophie and Ethan at a nearby cafe, he felt a flutter of nervous anticipation. Today marked a special occasion. It was Ethan's second birthday. Jack had carefully picked out a small gift, a wooden toy train he'd found in a quaint shop, knowing how much Ethan loved anything with wheels. But more than that, he hoped this day would mark the beginning of many more family traditions, simple moments that they could share and treasure. When he arrived at the cafe, he saw Sophie by the window, a bright smile lighting up her face as she spotted him. Ethan was sitting beside her in a high chair, his little hands reaching eagerly for the colorful balloons that Sophie had tied to the chair. "There he is, the birthday boy," Jack greeted with a warm smile, placing the wrapped toy in front of Ethan. The boy's eyes widened with excitement as he looked at the gift, his tiny fingers fumbling with the wrapping paper until he uncovered the wooden train. Sophie chuckled, watching Ethan's delighted expression. "He's obsessed with trains. I think you've just become his favorite person." Jack's heart swelled at the sight, the joy in Ethan's eyes and Sophie's laughter filling the room with a sense of warmth that made him feel truly at home. It was in these small, everyday moments, Ethan's laughter, Sophie's gentle presence, that he had found a happiness he hadn't thought possible. They spent the morning together, sharing stories, laughing, and savoring the little celebration they had created just for the three of them. Jack realized that these were the moments he had missed out on for so long, the simple joys of family, of watching a child grow, of sharing in each other's lives. He felt a quiet pride as he watched Sophie with Ethan, seeing the love and dedication she poured into being his mother. It was clear that she had inherited a strength and compassion that reminded him of Emma, but in her own unique way. As the hours slipped by, the conversation turned to the future, to the dreams they had yet to fulfill. Sophie looked at Jack, her expression thoughtful as she spoke. "You know, I've been thinking about moving closer to you," she said, her voice tinged with hope. "I want Ethan to grow up with you in his life, to have a real relationship with his grandfather." Jack's heart skipped a beat, the weight of her words settling over him with a profound sense of gratitude. He had spent so many years feeling isolated, disconnected from any real sense of family. And now, here she was, offering him a place in their lives, a chance to be part of something that mattered. "I'd love that, Sophie," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea how much this means to me. Being a part of your life, of Ethan's life, it's more than I could have ever hoped for." She smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "Thank you, Jack. For everything. For choosing to be here with us." In that quiet moment, Jack felt a sense of peace settle over him, a realization that he had been given a second chance, a chance to rebuild, to love, and to create new memories with the family he had found. He knew there would still be challenges, moments of doubt and pain, but he was no longer alone. Sophie and Ethan had filled his life with light, with purpose, and with a hope that he hadn't known he was missing. As they left the cafe, the sun broke through the winter clouds, casting a warm glow over the snowy streets. Jack held Ethan's tiny hand as they walked, feeling the boy's trust, his innocent joy, and knowing that this was only the beginning. Together, they had found a way to move forward, to heal, and to embrace the future with open hearts. With Sophie and Ethan by his side, Jack knew that he was finally home. And in that moment, as he watched Ethan giggling at the fluttering snowflakes, he realized that this was the life he had been searching for all along. Months passed, and the rhythm of Jack's life began to harmonize with Sophie and Ethan's presence. His once empty apartment, filled with silence and memories, was now alive with laughter, small toys scattered across the living room, and the warmth of family dinners. Ethan's laughter, Sophie's quiet strength, and Jack's growing joy painted a picture of family that, for a long time, he had believed was beyond his reach. One crisp spring day, Sophie asked Jack to meet her at the park, just as they had done when they first started reconnecting. Jack, sensing an important conversation ahead, arrived early, the calm yet vibrant park around him reflecting the new life he had found through Sophie and Ethan. When Sophie arrived, she carried a small, aged journal in her hand, Emma's journal. Jack recognized it immediately, his heart pounding as memories stirred. "Jack, I've read more of Mom's journal," Sophie began, her voice gentle but firm. "I wanted to understand her better. I needed to know the full story of who she was and why she made the choices she did." Jack listened, a sense of solemn anticipation gripping him. "There's a passage I think you should hear," Sophie said, opening the journal to a specific page. Her voice trembled slightly as she read. "Jack will never understand why I had to keep this from him. I thought I was protecting him, but in truth, I was terrified of losing the life we were building. He deserves to know the truth, but I can't bring myself to tell him. I only hope that one day he'll find peace in the life we shared." Sophie looked up, her eyes filled with empathy as she met Jack's gaze. "I think she loved you deeply, Jack. She made mistakes, but she tried to protect you in the way she thought was best. I've come to realize that she kept you in her heart, even if her choices created pain." Jack took a deep breath, his heart swelling with a mixture of sorrow and understanding. Emma had indeed loved him, even if her choices had created rifts he could never bridge. Hearing Sophie's voice deliver those words, seeing her standing there with Emma's journal in her hands, he felt a kind of release, a forgiveness, not only of Emma, but of himself. "You're right, Sophie," Jack replied, his voice steady. "I think I've spent so long focusing on what was missing that I forgot to cherish what we did have. She'll always be a part of me, of us. But I think it's time to let go and start fresh." Sophie smiled, relief and warmth in her eyes. "That's all she would have wanted, Jack, for you to find happiness and move forward." They sat in silence, watching Ethan play nearby, his innocent joy filling the space around them with a lightness that felt like healing. Jack knew that, for all the sorrow he had carried, he had found a new purpose, a family, and a reason to embrace life once more. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, Jack looked at Sophie and felt a profound sense of gratitude. "Thank you, Sophie, for bringing this into my life, for helping me see things I hadn't seen before. I never thought I'd find happiness again, but here I am." Sophie reached out, wrapping him in a gentle embrace. "We're family, Jack, and no matter what the past held, we have a future to build together." As they walked home with Ethan's tiny hand in his, Jack knew that this chapter of his life had finally reached its true beginning. Emma's memory would always be there, but with Sophie and Ethan, he was ready to face whatever came next, grounded in love, forgiveness, and a newfound hope for tomorrow. If you found this story meaningful, please hit subscribe to the Inspiring Hearts channel to discover more touching stories about precious moments in life, the love of family, and the power of forgiveness. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you won't miss any of the stories we share. Thank you for joining us and sharing the inspiration.